Eye, iris, iris. In humans and most mammals and birds, the iris, plural irids, or irises, is a thin annular structure in the eye responsible for controlling the diameter and the size of the pupil and thus the amount of light reaching the retina. Eye color is defined by that of the iris. In optic terms, the pupil eye's aperture, a hole or opening through which light travels, more specifically an aperture and the focal length of an optical system determined the cone, angle, and bundle of rays that come to focus in an image plane, while the iris is diaphragm, the opaque structure with an opening aperture at its center. The role of the diaphragm is to stop the passage of light, except the light passing through the aperture. Thus it is alkylated a stop. The diaphragm is placed in the light path of the lens, and the iris or objective and the size of the aperture regulates the amount of light that passes through the lens. The center of the diaphragm's aperture coincides with optic axis of the lens system. So, okay, when you look at the eye, here's the lens we're talking about. Okay, the aperture, the angle, the interior chamber, the iris, right? The iris, posterior chamber, anterior chamber. Everyone knows that lens. The optic disc is behind the eye. See there? The retina is actually starts here and goes around the retina. Okay. There's something called schematic just above the lens. The vitreous body, and what that actually means right here. If you take another look, optic nerve muscles. This is coming in very kind of not wanting to focus. There we go. Lateral rectus, inferior rectus. That's what it looks like, and that's what it's called. You have bones and muscles in there as well. Now, why I failed to put in pupil here, I'm not quite sure. But I guess I left out the obvious part because there's so much more to this than just the pupil. So if you want to still frame this, try to still frame a perfect image and download it or whatever, or keep looking at it. Here's some of the brain, this is a very basic drawing of the brain. So let's try to make some connections here. We saw the inferior oblique, which is the eye muscle. The inferior oblique muscle, or obulus oculi inferior, is thin, narrow muscle placed in the anterior margin of the floor of the orbit. So we'll get to what that means. Is the orbit is the cavity or socket of the skull in which the eye and its appendages are situated. Orbit can refer to the bony socket, or it can also be used to imply the contents. In adult human, the volume of the orbit is 30 milliliters, of which the eye occupies 6.5 millimeters, or 0.22 U.S. fluid ounces. The orbital contents comprise the eye. The orbital and retrobulbar fascia, which is like skin. Fascia is like skin. Extraocular muscles, cranial muscles 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. blood vessels, fat, lacrimal gland with its sac and duct, eyelids, medial and lateral polyarable ligaments, cheek ligaments, or check ligaments, the suspensory ligament septum, ciliary ganglion, and the short ciliary nerves, and where that orbit, what an orbit actually is, and how it relates to the eye muscle of the inferior oblique is right here. On the graph I showed you, but no, there's an orbit about there in your eye. And it does go on here. The inferior oblique is an extraocular muscle and is attached to the maxillary bone origin in its posterior inferior lateral surface of the eye insertion. So it's there when doctors use like lateral inferior, they're just trying to point to where it is on your body. So it's all this is basically saying it's situated, inserted where I showed you. Inferior oblique is inverted by the inferior branch of the ocular motor nerve structure. The inferior oblique arises from the orbital surface of maxilla lateral to the lacrimal groove. Unlike the other extraocular muscles, recti and superior oblique, the inferior oblique muscle does not originate from common tendinous ring, annulus of Zinn. You saw that weird annulus of Zinn on the graph. Passing lateral backward and upward between the inferior rectus and the floor of the orbit. And just underneath the lateral rectus muscle, the inferior oblique inserts into the sclera, is what that says. So we went from here, from the sclera to the inferior oblique. Sclera, inferior oblique, and of course the iris. Okay. In a later video, I'll show you the chart that what lateral, inferior, and all that means. I have a chart for that as well, but I'm going to go through it professionally now. So now that I showed the graph of the brain, I'll just show you what basically everyone learns. This is what everyone should know: the medulla oblongata, the continuation of the spinal cord within the skull, forming the lowest part of the brainstem and containing control centers for the heart and lungs. I think earlier in like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they really didn't even know much about the brain at all, apparently. And that brings you to the thalamus. That's what we've heard before. Either two masses of gray matter lying between the cerebral hemispheres on either side of the ventricle, relaying sensory information and acting as a center for pain perception. And I define ventricle down here. What is a ventricle? A hollow part or cavity in an organ. Each of the two main chambers of the heart, left and right. Each of the four connected fluid-filled cavities in the center of the brain. So ventricle can mean different things. Alright, that's all for now. And thank you.